Good evening, and welcome to Solidarity on Tap. My name is Chris Kerr with the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and on behalf of everyone at ISN, as well as our national Solidarity on Tap sponsors, Mary Noel Lay Missioners, Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest, thanks to everyone for joining in. For over 15 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been uniting the Ignatian family, meaning the Jesuit network, as well as all those who are inspired to work for justice through the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola, to build a more just world through faith-based social justice formation, education, and advocacy. If you haven't already, please check out our website, ignatiansolidarity.net, and like and follow us on social media to get the latest advocacy alerts, educational resources, and much more. Now, here's the thing. Solidarity on Tap usually takes place in cities across the country, bringing together members of the Ignatian family. And even though we're gathering tonight virtually, the goal of Solidarity on Tap is the same: to invite people to enjoy fellowship, maybe with a drink in hand, and to hear powerful reflections from members of the network engaged in work for justice. Now, in order to build and enjoy fellowship tonight, I want to encourage everybody who's out there, everybody who's watching, to utilize the comment section on Facebook, on YouTube, or to tweet or post on Twitter and Instagram with the hashtag ISNLive to let us know you and your institution are represented here tonight. All right, so we want to hear from you. Let us know you're there, okay? And if you have a question or a comment during our time with our guests tonight, you can post it on those social media channels, right? So don't be afraid to post a question or give an affirmation to our speaker as we go along tonight. All right, we're excited to have you with us and excited to engage with you. Now, as we join together as an Ignatian family this evening, we are holding all the people affected by COVID-19 in our prayers. We also hold in our prayers those who've been victims of race-based violence, especially those who lost their lives in recent days and those who are using their bodies, their words, their actions to stand for racial justice. We also know that across the country there are people who have been impacted by storms and other natural events. They're in our prayers too. We hope that tonight's conversation provides us the opportunity to explore the important work that is being done and reflect on a hope-filled future. And with us this evening is Marie Dennis, who I'm excited to introduce. She's a good friend of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and we're so grateful to have her here tonight. Marie is Senior Advisor to the Secretary General of Pax Christi International, the global Catholic peace movement. She was co-president of Pax Christi International from 2007 to 2019 and serves on the executive committee of Pax Christi's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Marie worked for the Mary Noel Missioners from 1989 to 2012, including 15 years as director of the Mary Noel Office for Global Concerns. She holds a master's degree in moral theology from the Washington Theological Union. Marie is author or co-author of 7 different books and editor of Choosing Peace: The Catholic Church Returns to Gospel Nonviolence. She's lectured at many universities and conferences over the past 40 years on topics ranging from Catholic social teaching to U.S. foreign policy, peace, nonviolence and reconciliation, the global economy, climate change, migration, and the nuclear arms race. She has founded initiatives dedicated to education, affordable housing, and action for social justice, as well as peace. The Ignatian Solidarity Network has been honored to welcome Marie to the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice on a number of occasions, including in 2014 when she offered a keynote address as we commemorated 25 years at that time since the Jesuits and 2 lay women were murdered at the University of Central America in El Salvador. And I just happened to rewatch that keynote recently. It was a beautiful, beautiful address. Welcome, Marie. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. We're so grateful to have you, and glad you could join us. I've known you for many years, and I think I even knew you before you knew me. Back when I was working with the Interreligious Task Force in Central America and in Northeast Ohio, and you came to give a talk about the church women for their annual commemoration. But can you, for those who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, you heard a little bit about your bio of your long history with Mary Noel and with Pax Christi. Can you talk a little bit about that work over the years and how it's gotten you to doing the work you are today with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Chris. It's really, really nice to be here. And I'm a big fan of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, so it's good to be with you. Yeah, by when you're as old as I am, that's a long story. But I think at a very basic level, I began moving in one direction. My undergraduate studies were in physics, and I expected to be in the scientific field for the rest of my life. I married shortly after college and very quickly had several children. I have 6 children now. They're all adults and married, and I have 9 grandchildren. But it was in the years following the Second Vatican Council, I just happened to have an opportunity to be part of a really dynamic, wonderful parish and parish community. It's a community that still exists. It's called the Pax community in Northern Virginia. It began at St. Luke's Parish there. And we simply took the documents of the Second Vatican Council and those that immediately followed on the social teaching of the church very seriously, and began to ask hard questions about what would it mean to be a parish that pursued justice, social justice, and peace. What would it look like if we as individuals and families began to try to live in a way that was more consistent with the gospel? And so both in the community that I was part of, the parish I was part of, and then as a family, we began on what has been the rest of my life journey to try to live out the gospel to the best of our ability in the 20th and 21st centuries. So we moved from what was a suburban home and in a suburban parish to a very rural area in Virginia. I lived on a farm for about 10 years because we wanted to give our children the experience of doing work that was life-giving, even as we tried to address the violences and injustices in the world. So that was a great experience. We were on the farm for about 10 years. After that, with children, I started with 3 friends, an intentional community in the inner city of Washington. 2 of my children were old enough to be on their own at that point, but 4 of them moved into the community. And my youngest son actually grew up there. Still live in the community, SAZ community. And it was from that base then that the rest of my work really took place. I have to say that I think probably the most important work for justice that I've tried to do, that I've been doing in the last many decades, has been how I raised my children, how we tried to share with their children what we believed and tried to kind of live with some integrity what we were saying publicly. So from my perspective, the most important work that I did was being a mother and a grandmother. But I also have loved the work for justice that I've done, starting in the parish where I was in right after the Vatican Council. We began to ask very deep questions about how we could live in our community in a way that was just. And from there, it's been kind of just the next right step after another, because of the particularly the repression and wars in Central America and Latin America in the 70s and 80s. I became very deeply involved in the work for justice in El Salvador, particularly, also in Guatemala and Nicaragua. And it began it was out of that space that I began to connect with Maryknoll and had the gift of being hired by Maryknoll to do work that was just a phenomenal opportunity. In those years working for Maryknoll, and then my connection to Pax Christi International was through Maryknoll. because Pax Christi International and Maryknoll work in so many of the same places in different parts of the world. And my work for, probably 30 years, gave me this just phenomenal opportunity to visit Maryknoll missioners, priests, brothers, sisters, lay missioners, Maryknoll affiliates, and Pax Christi members and member organizations in communities all over the world, and sort of never as a sightseer, but always as a guest of a local community that was committed to justice, struggling for their own rights, and from which I learned enormous amounts. There are lots of tributaries to that story, but that may be enough to get us started.
That was great, Maria. I really appreciate you talking about your role as a parent being, a significant part of your work for your work of peace and justice, and I can empathize with that as a father of three boys. And I'd just be curious, like, what are some examples of ways that you felt like you carried that out as a parent over the years with your children, kind of helping to instill in them a commitment to justice? Because I think that's one of the things that I've noticed about the work of the Ignatian Solidarity Network over the years. We've been around for 15 years, right? And we started out, we worked predominantly with young people who were in college, high school, coming out of college, high school. But all of us have gotten older, and now many folks have kids, and they're trying to figure out how to be people of justice, people of faith, with kind of a different way of living life than they were when they were initially involved with us. What were some things, as you were a parent, that that were intentional decisions, or things that maybe even they weren't intentional decisions but were pivotal, for your kids' development?
That's an interesting question. You should probably ask my children for an answer to that question. But I guess there are a couple of things that were, I think, were important. And the only way I can even say that now is knowing my children and seeing the values that they have and the way they're now raising their children. It's really great to see. Maybe at a fundamental level, I think there were two things. One was just trying to live with integrity, trying to do what we said we believed in, whatever that was. And another is that I believe that children rise up to challenges in a way that sometimes we forget. And so I find that that young children and older children, they have a great capacity to understand the world that we live in, and to recognize that the way that we live, the choices that we make, have an impact on other people in our own community or in our nation or around the world. So to start with, living on the farm was great. We worked really hard physically, and those who grew up on the farm really came to love the earth. And so even as little children, we tried to farm organically. We really didn't know what we were doing, but we learned a lot in the years we were there. And so did they. And I see that in their lives all the time now. The other piece, I think, was to do everything. And part of our reason for even moving to the farm was to move to a community, neighborhoods, a farming neighborhood that was very diverse, economically diverse, fairly racially diverse, but mostly economically diverse. And that was just a great experience for them. And they just didn't have a whole lot growing up. There were real limits to what we could do and what they could expect, and so it really convinced me that young children are able to rise up to challenges much more than I think we think. The other is to help them understand what it means to look at reality through the lens of people who are marginalized in our society. Even as we tried to be careful with the way we were living, we started out as people of privilege. We were educated. My children were all educated. We had a basic. We knew that we had a roof over our heads and a safe place to live, and so on. But I think for the children to understand that not everybody has that kind of privilege, and that the way they should try to look at life was through the lens of someone who was marginalized, who was not in such a secure and safe place. And we did that partly by where we lived. I mean, moving into the community, we moved into the Assisi community. 4 of the children were here, and we lived in a neighborhood that was very violent at that time, just very rough. And it was a great experience for them, because what they learned was that it was a beautiful place to live, and there were good people living here, and that it was not a sort of lost and forgotten neighborhood. They also had the opportunity, each of them, as they got older, to sort of make choices that themselves. One of my daughters lived in the Middle East for quite a long time. Others visited other parts of the world, or spent time in parts of our own country that are more marginal. But that was what I was able to do for my grandchildren. So by the time my grandchildren were old enough, by the time they were 13, as each of them turned 13, there are still a few that haven't gotten to that yet. When I was going on a trip internationally where I could bring them with me, I tried to do that. And so I was able to bring them to a couple to El Salvador, and one to Haiti, and to Mexico, and one to the Middle East, and then to help them think about what they were seeing and hearing and learning. And part of it was always something about the wisdom and struggle that people are engaged in, that sometimes are described as very poor or unable to fend for themselves. And then also they saw the beauty and the life in a place like the West Bank or other parts of the Middle East. So I don't think there's a magic answer, but I believe that it is a very important and a good work, and that it bears beautiful fruit.
Yeah, that's great, and we'll have to have your kids on sometime to get their perspective, right?
Yeah.
To get their opinion on it all. It's thanks for sharing that, and for as a parent, I think a lot about what am I leading my kids towards? How am I helping them to? What lens am I inviting them to see the world? So I really appreciate you offering that perspective from hindsight in many ways. I want to talk a little bit about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, but before we do that, we got a bunch of folks that are here with us tonight. I just want to say hi to them. So welcome to Jeannie Anderson West, who's joining us from Sacramento, St. Ignatius Loyola Parish. Welcome, Jeannie. Mara is joining us from Motor City, from Detroit. Welcome. Justin's says hello, Ignatian family. I think Justin's joining us from Baltimore. Welcome to Justin. Jackie's joining us from Miami, Florida. Welcome, Jackie. Thanks for being with us. Beth is from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Welcome to Beth. Pat, who I think you probably know, Marie, says hello from Arlington, Virginia, not too far from where you are. That's great. Let's see. Karen says, thanks, ISN. And Marie here representing Maryknoll Missioners from Maryland. Excellent. Mara's joining us from the Yonah Mountain Campground in Georgia. That's impressive, on the campground. Elise is saying hello from Venice, California. She's an LMU grad, following along with St. Mark Young Adult Ministry. watch party. Welcome to Elisa. So great to have all those folks with us. Again, don't forget to share your comments, your questions, or just let us know you're out there. And if you got an institution you want to lift up in the process, that's wonderful too. Let's talk a little bit about your work with Pax Christi, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Can you tell us about that initiative, which began in 2016? Tell us what that is, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative.
At a very fundamental level, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is the fruit of of many years of a commitment to nonviolence on the part of Pax Christi International, but most especially in the aftermath of 9/11. Pax Christi began to ask, why is it that we so often think that the only response that we can make, even in very dangerous situations, is a violent response? It's, it just seemed like we were lacking imagination, and we began to have to gather stories and perspective from, most especially from people living in zones of conflict and war and zones of conflict in our own cities, to ask what else could be done than to sort of heighten the armed response to violence. For several years, we recognized that, for example, as the United States was spending hundreds of billions of dollars, now $730 billion, preparing for war, we were not spending anything like that, developing other tools that were clearly effective or would be effective in a number of situations. There was some research done in around 2011, 2012 that demonstrated empirically that a nonviolent effort to, for example, oust a dictator or stop repression was twice as effective as an armed revolution or uprising. And so we just tried to build on that. And we decided that as a Catholic organization, we looked around to say, well, now where could we really make a difference? And we decided that we would try to move the institutional Catholic Church to engage more deeply in understanding nonviolence and committing to teaching nonviolence. So imagine if all of the Catholic universities in the world, all of the Catholic elementary schools, all of the parishes, all of the Catholic communications channels, and on and on and on, the diplomats at the UN, the Vatican has diplomatic relations in almost every country and at all of the multilateral institutions. Couldn't the church make a big difference in helping us to understand what nonviolence is and teach people about it, how to use it? And to begin with, so we pestered the Vatican for several years after Pope Francis was elected Pope. And finally, in 2016, the Vatican and the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace agreed to co-sponsor a small conference with us on nonviolence and just peace. And we brought about 80 people together from many, many, many different countries at war and zones of violence to ask them, does nonviolence make any sense to you? And literally one after another talked about their successful efforts to implement nonviolent strategies, even in the middle of terrible violence and war. And the frustration that they had that there wasn't very much invested in that. So that was kind of out of that conference came the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And for the last 4 years, we've been engaged in a very active conversation with the Catholic community, with the Vatican, but then also with Catholic universities and Catholic organizations like Caritas and JRS and others, about what is nonviolence and how can we move beyond thinking, using the sort of framework of, is this a just war or not, and begin to think in a more positive way about how can we use nonviolence to build the kind of societies that we want to build, and develop a nonviolent framework for the way we want the world to look. And I think over these years, the need for that has become more and more evident. Nonviolence is not only the absence of violence, it's a way of life, it's a spirituality, it's a set of very effective tools and strategies to accomplish the kind of just world that we are working for. It is also it is a counter also to the multiple violences that we see. So, for example, the violence of racism, the violence of economic injustice, the violence of ecological injustice, and on and on. Where what we know is that violence is sometimes direct; it's war or somebody punching someone else, but it's also structural, it's systemic, it's cultural, and we are that of all of the recognitions that we are seeing now, thanks both to the pandemic and to the response to the racial violence that we've seen in our country and around the world. What we're hearing more and more is a recognition of violence that is systemic and structural, and injustice that is systemic and structural. So the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is advocating for a major document from the Vatican, and for the Church institutionally to invest in a serious way in doing more research on what nonviolent approaches would work, doing more education. How do we think about nonviolence as everything from diplomacy to trauma healing, restorative justice, yes, civil resistance. We've seen lots of nonviolent actions in the last few weeks, thank goodness. But it's much, much bigger than that. And so we've had a lot of many interesting conversations with Catholic universities, with the International Association of Catholic Universities, with the pontifical, different pontifical offices, and most especially with the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, Cardinal Turkson and his colleagues in the Dicastery. We've been involved in the COVID-19 commission that the Vatican has pulled together to help us imagine what is the future. How do we not go back to what was a deeply unjust normal? How do we move forward to a different framework? And we believe that just as that has an ecological face, and we see that in the work being done around Laudato Si, it also has a nonviolent face, both in what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to get there. So it's a very grassroots movement, and it's also an engagement with the institutional Catholic Church, the likes of which I've certainly not had before. So it's been very interesting.
And Maria, of course, it's rooted in, this work is rooted in the gospel.
Absolutely.
And people, I've heard you speak about it. I've heard others involved with Pax Christi and with the initiative talk about the idea of gospel nonviolence. But I also feel like in our church, we hear people talk about kind of contrast and say, yes, Jesus was nonviolent, but we also have just war theory. So our violence is justified at times. How do we make sense of kind of those two visions of what our faith teaches us about nonviolence and violence?
Yeah. Challenging question. Absolutely. The more you study the Gospels, and especially understand the historical context in which Jesus was living, the clearer it has become to me, particularly, that Jesus really had a powerful nonviolent message about nonviolence, both in what he said, but also in how he lived, and that really, the cross was the ultimate nonviolent action, if you will. But over the years, many years, 1,000 years or so, the church has used the framework of the just war, particularly as a way to prevent war, to reduce the number of wars, to exact some pretty strict criteria, that all of which had to be met before there could be any thought that a war, that it was legitimate to use militarized violence. What we're saying is, well, to begin with, over the 19th, but especially through the 20th century, and particularly in the second half of the 20th century, when significant examples of the power of nonviolence began to get more visibility. I mean, from Gandhi and the Dr. King here, to the people power revolution in the Philippines, to the pulling down of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the Eastern European revolutions, the power of nonviolence became very clear, and the church, through that time, began to, whereas at first the teaching was, well, the just war, we need to provide a tool, the church thought, for to function in the public arena. And so here are some criteria that we believe will diminish the likelihood of going to war using violence. And a pacifist or a commitment to nonviolence, a pacifist position or a commitment to nonviolence is a fine for an individual, for a personal ethical choice. Throughout the 20th century, a couple of things began to happen. One of them is that it became clearer and clearer that pacifism as a personal, as an ethic against the use of any kind of force or violent force, that there was a difference between pacifism and nonviolence. That nonviolence was, yes, it was a lifestyle, a personal way of being, a spirituality, but that was gospel rooted. But it was also a very powerful tool that could be used to work for justice, to promote peace. So the church began to teach it, the relationship between the just war tradition and the tradition of nonviolence, even in formal teaching. So even in 1993, 1992, the Catholic Church in the United States talked about nonviolence as an underdeveloped tool that we had, that political leaders needed to look much more deeply into the potential for nonviolence. What we've been saying over the last many years, is that we respect, as an organization, as Pax Christi, and personally as a member of Pax Christi, I respect those who have used the just war tradition and framework to try to make war rare. But I am really convinced that we have never invested in nonviolent options, or we've done very little of teaching or understanding the potential of nonviolence. And therefore, I don't think we can ever really claim that the use of violence is an absolutely last resort. We just simply haven't gone down the road of nonviolence to find out what we can do. And so more and more, we are beginning to see the church turn in a direction. You can hear it in what Pope Francis is saying. Cardinal Turkson, Cardinal Tobin, and Bishop McElroy in our own country, and so on, are talking about nonviolence as a universal ethic that would provide a framework whereby we could deal with even extreme violence if we recognize that another whole framework of addressing the potential for violence exists. It's, the just peace framework has many different iterations, but it's a serious proposal about a completely different way to contribute in the political arena, in the public arena, to helping political decision makers make decisions about when the use of how to think about the use of force. The debate right now around should we defund police forces is fascinating in this context, because essentially what I understand that cry is about, it is about the fact that the public investment over the last many decades has gone in the direction of assuming that the only way we could provide security in our neighborhoods or our cities or our country was by increasing militarization of the police. And from our perspective, from the perspective of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, it's absolutely the wrong direction. So lots of connections to what's happening now.
Sure. Thanks, Marie. And I want to come back to, I think you were kind of leading us to talking a little bit about what's happened over the past couple of weeks. And I want to come back to that and kind of contextualize it in that vision of gospel nonviolence that you've laid out for us. But I want to make sure we do a couple announcements, talk about our sponsors, and also say hello to some other folks who join us. So Irene Hodgson at Xavier University says hello. And I know Irene's done some great work in Central America over the years. And Adriana says hello from Miami, Florida. Mary Kay is in Columbia, Maryland. Ted says is representing the Maryknoll Missioners in Hudson Valley, New York. So welcome to Ted. Let's see. And also there's one more we're going to say hi to. Irene, hi from Maryknoll Missioners, she says. And then, Francisco Mena says, greetings from El Salvador. So, Francisco, great to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to take a quick break, so grab a quick sip of whatever you're drinking there, and we'll come back to you in a second. I want to tell folks about some upcoming opportunities to engage with us before I tell you about our sponsors. The first is something called the Justice League. And it sounds like it's going to involve superheroes flying across the world trying to root out injustice. It's kind of true. You can join the Justice League, a dynamic group of social justice practitioners gathering to read and discuss excerpts from classical social justice texts, including an author Q&A. Our next conversation will be on the book The Pastoral Circle Revisited, featuring Father Pete Henriot, SJ, on Thursday, June 18th at 1 p.m. You can visit igsol.net, igsol.net/justice-league to register. So make sure to check that out. Secondly, you can be part of the first ever virtual Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. So the teach-in will be moving virtual during this unique time that we will face in the coming months. You can join the largest annual Catholic social justice gathering in the country from a screen near you. The IFTJ will take place from October 19th to 26th, 2020. Registration will open on June 22nd, and additional information can be found at igsol.net/IFTJ. That's igsol.net/IFTJ. Also, you can join the Ignatian Solidarity Network in calling on Congress to ensure the protection of those most in need amid the COVID-19 crisis, including asking our elected officials for measures to improve the economic security of the most vulnerable and address the unique health risks posed to people in our prisons, migrants, low-income communities, and communities of color, which already bear the burden of poor environmental and health conditions. You can take action right now by texting COVID, that's COVID, to 202-800-1541. That's COVID to 202-800-1541. That'll direct you to an action alert where you can immediately send a message to your congressional members. And now let me tell you about our sponsors really quickly. First, the Maryknoll Missioners, who work internationally with those at the margins for a more just, compassionate, and sustainable world. To learn more about their work, join their Meet a Missioner Monday live streams on their Facebook page every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Secondly, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, known as JVC, is a full-time volunteer program that works for social justice while exploring spirituality and faith through a framework of Catholic Ignatian values for individuals between 21 and 35 years of age. You can learn more at jesuitvolunteers.org. And finally, JVC Northwest, focused on the core values of community, simple living, social and ecological justice, and spirituality and reflection. JVC Northwest is a national direct AmeriCorps program serving 24 locales across Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. And you must be 21 or over to be eligible for JVC Northwest. You can learn more at jvcnorthwest.org. Now, if you like the conversation this evening and want to share it or watch again, this and all the previous videos of Solidarity on Tap are available at ignatiansolidarity.net or on our YouTube or Facebook pages, so make sure to check those out, okay? Also, if you enjoyed Solidarity on Tap tonight, please consider giving a gift to sustain the work of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And you can do that at ignatiansolidarity.net/donate. You can also share a picture of yourself watching or having a virtual watch party to your Instagram account and tag Ignatian Solidarity. That's our Instagram handle. And make sure to use that hashtag ISN Live. We want to feature you in our story about tonight's Solidarity on Tap. So make sure to get a picture of what's happening there at wherever you are watching tonight. All right. So Marie, let's come back to you, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of where we are right now. But I want to come back to what you shared in terms of that conference in Rome. And I know that Pope Francis shared remarks. I think they might have been presented by Cardinal Turkson, but shared remarks. And I was really moved by one of his quotes. He said, "As Christians, we know that it is only by considering our peers as brothers and sisters that we will overcome wars and conflicts." And I was thinking a lot about this quote in the context of where we are right now in the midst of a little over 2 weeks since George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and the great attention that's been brought to the situation of racial inequity in our country, of racism. Using the lens of gospel nonviolence, how do we understand, or how do we move forward, in our world, in our country, through that lens?
Well, I think at a very fundamental level, Chris, using a lens of nonviolence, we have to start by understanding what violence is. And so in the last weeks, I think that what was most visible was the violence of racism, and that it is a systemic, deep systemic violence that has been harming and killing African Americans and people of color in our nation and in many other nations for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think that's where the conversation about nonviolence at this moment needs to start. We were already seeing, as I said before, that the COVID-19 has exposed deep violence and injustice, structural and systemic violence in our own country and around the world. And then the killing of George Floyd and the response to that killing has helped us to see in our own society, once again, this is certainly not the first time, once again, the depth of violence that racism perpetrates in our society. So for me, a really great sign of hope in these few weeks has been that finally the public conversation is not only about personal prejudice and personal expressions of racism, which it is and it has to be, but it is also about the way our society is put together that perpetuates the violence of racism. And from my perspective, calling it violence describes it very accurately, because that is how it's experienced over and over and over again by people on the receiving end of racism. So the intersection in these weeks of both the exposure of the violence of racism, the exposure of the violence of poverty, and the other consequences of racism and damage that has been done in people's lives who don't have access to decent jobs or to safe housing or to healthcare, and on and on. We've seen that not only, again, in our own country, but around the world. That I think, to see an uprising of people around this country and around the world who are ready to recognize that something very deep has to change is very hopeful. And I hope we will not go back to business as usual. I hope that in a week we won't forget the work that we have to do. I'm very encouraged to see city councils and legislatures in different places trying to grapple with, well, what do we mean by police reform? Or what do we mean by defunding the police? Where should we be putting our money instead? And at the heart of that conversation is exactly what we've been talking about in terms of what is nonviolence. If in my neighborhood, if the only response to providing security in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., is to have more police on the corners and with their guns drawn, and that's an exaggeration, obviously, then we're missing the root causes of the problem, because we're not dealing with unjust housing, unjust educational system, with the enabling people to deal with the experiences of trauma that have affected lives all over the city and all over our country. So investment in the social safety net, in social programs, in educational reform, in providing affordable housing, and on, is where the money should be going, rather than in militarizing the police. And so the connections right now are huge, and they're connections that have everything to do with racism and the tentacles of racism in poverty and lack of health care, and on. But it also points right to what we've been seeing with the COVID pandemic. It's pretty breathtaking.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions from folks who are watching tonight. One of them is from Sister Sheila Marie Toby, who's an Ursuline sister. She spent time in South Africa, and we're grateful to have her joining us tonight. She asked, she shared a little bit about a conversation she's had with a local police officer in her community, who talked a little bit about the ways that the militarization of police and the use of kind of military style gear and weaponry, the way it can impact kind of how officers carry themselves, like as they go out into the community. And this is something that I've noticed too in the images of of police interaction with those participating in demonstrations and protest rallies the past 2 weeks. The significant way, and the New York Times actually did a big piece on this about the amount of money that goes into outfitting a police officer in military style gear compared to the amount of money that a protester puts into their own gear, which it doesn't really weigh out. What's the impact of this militarization of our community safety for our police officers? Like what does that do to us? How does that impact us? And how, in contrast to some of the things you talked about in terms of values of nonviolence, it seems in direct contradiction to what you've described.
Oh, I think it is. And I think it is damaging both to the police officers and to the community for the same reasons. And I think the question that I would ask is why? Why are we doing this? And I think one of the things that, this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, but it is constantly somewhere in the picture, is somebody's making a lot of money by ensuring that military style equipment or military weapons or military vehicles are being given, sold to, circulated among the police. So a really huge challenge, I think, when you talk about violence and nonviolence, when you talk about the militarization of police, and I think it is harming the police officers because it is making them be who they are not, and it is harming the community. I think that one of the greatest challenges is that we have built our economy in almost every congressional district across this country. There are businesses that are relying on making, selling weapons, hiring people to make and sell weapons or military equipment, and on and on. So we have a big job of a word that was used at the end of the Cold War that never got very much traction was economic conversion. But that is a huge challenge, and we're blind to that need right now. So, and the one other thing that I want to say about what we're expecting of the police forces that is just completely unjust is that we are asking them to be social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, truant officers, and on and on and on. And we're asking them to do jobs for which they are not trained. And so giving them more military equipment doesn't help them deal with the trauma of a young person who's acting out in school, and on and on. So deep problems.
Yeah, and the list goes on. Animal warden. I mean, and many
all of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We had a question from Ted that kind of gets to a point. You talked about the role that money plays in some of these underlying realities of violence that exist in our society. He asked the question about kind of consumerism, placing profits of corporations over human dignity, whether it's around just wages or environmental protections. Deregulation that enables greater profits. I mean, some of this, as we over the past couple of weeks, I mean, some of this seems so obvious, right? I've been amazed. I shouldn't say amazed, but I've been heartened, I guess I would say, by people who said, I watched George Floyd be killed right there on the street. I watched that video, and I people say I cried. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked. All these different emotions, but we have these underlying realities of kind of covert violence, and like economics. I mean, how do we help people understand the complexity of this? Because there's so much that goes into systemic racism. How do we help people see that in our world?
It's not easy. I don't think. I guess that for me, that the approach that helps me is to just try to never stop asking questions. Asking questions about my own lifestyle. We all know this. Where did my clothes come from? Where does my food come from? Who transported it? Who raised it? Who made it? How well do they get paid? What is behind this militarization of the police? Why is that happening in our society? Why can't we build affordable housing in our society? Why is why is it perpetually happening that a few people in our society, and more in every society around the world, a few people are benefiting from the way an economy is put together, rather than ensuring that everyone has access to good work or to a basic income, and on and on. So for me, asking why is pretty basic. It goes. I mean, you were talking about Pete Henrio's conversation later this month around the pastoral circle. To me, that's the only way that we begin to see how the world works. There are phenomenal books out right now that help us who often have been too blind to the consequences or the reality of racism in our own society. There are phenomenal books that are pointing, describing, helping us see what am I reading. I just think that it's a constant challenge. And then I also think that we have to learn to have respectful dialogue across differences of opinion. That's pretty obvious right now, but too often I think we lose sight of the fact that so many of the deep issues deep changes that we need to make are structural. It's not that they're bad people, and so we shouldn't necessarily be attacking individuals, but we have to find ways to disagree around how they're behaving or how we're behaving or how our society is behaving. So I think we have a lot of skills to build that also have to do with nonviolence. There is a whole discipline of nonviolent communication that we could use a lot of lessons on. And so not easy answers, but always asking questions why, I think, is pretty basic.
That's a good way to close it out, Marie. We've really enjoyed this conversation tonight. It's always so great to talk with you and to spend a little time with you, and especially amidst this COVID-19 reality. It's great to reconnect with folks that I haven't seen in a little while. So great to be with you. Thank you so much for your reflections and insights, and for taking the time to be with us. Before we close out, I just want to remind folks that if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, don't worry. It's recorded. You can go back and find it. Just visit IgnatianSolidarity.net or our YouTube or Facebook pages to find it. I also want to apologize that there were a number of questions that were submitted we didn't have time to get to. So appreciate your thoughts and ideas, and sorry we didn't get to them tonight, but make sure to join us in a couple weeks for our next Solidarity on Tap. And speaking of that, we will gather again for Solidarity on Tap on June 24th. We'll welcome Marissa Montes, who's the director and co-founder of the Loyola Immigrant Justice Clinic. It's the immigration law clinic at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. We'll be excited to talk with Marissa. It'll come at a key time in the context of immigration, as the DACA Supreme Court decision will likely come out soon, and also creates an opportunity to talk about other issues related to immigration and learn about Marissa's story as well. So again, thank you so much to Marie, and thank you to everyone for joining us for Solidarity on Tap this evening. We hope you have a great night.